I was a teenager when I accepted that I no longer wanted to practice the religion of my childhood. I'd had my questions and doubts for a long time, but I had looked past them out of respect for my mom. My mother was the churchgoer in our family, and she was the Christian I knew best. Her religion was rooted in compassion for others, in doing her best to live in harmony with the world around her. I could see her religion in her career choice, nursing. I could see her religion in her participation in the Methodist and Presbyterian churches of my childhood. She taught Sunday school. She helped with the food pantry. She was a lead volunteer for several years in providing Christmas presents for our neediest neighbors. I could see her religion in her prayer life. Many were the mornings when I would find her copy of The Upper Room, a daily devotional guide, on the kitchen table, so I knew she had been reading it before she left for work. I could see her religion in how she took care of her friends, how she checked in on people, how she cooked meals for them, baked and delivered pies. And I could see her religion in her parenting. I had no doubt that she loved me unconditionally, and that she wanted me to find my own path, and that she would seek to understand that path and love me along the way the very best that she could. I was so certain of her unconditional love that I didn't worry I would lose it the night I told her the truth. We were doing dishes together, a time when we would have the few heart-to-hearts a teenage boy is capable of having with his mother. I don't think I believe a lot of that stuff we say in church, I told her. I'm guessing she knew what I meant because she didn't try to convince me that I was wrong. She said, religion isn't about always believing. It's about trying to believe. Looking back, I think she may have been suggesting to me that it's okay not to be sure, and that for her, sticking with her faith, even though she didn't always understand it, had made a positive difference in her life. At the time, however, I interpreted her counsel to be, fake it till you make it, Mark. But I didn't want to fake it anymore. I wanted to be true to myself. I wanted to live with integrity. I wanted to live in alignment with my understandings the very best that I could. I wasn't sure I believed in God, and until I knew for sure, I didn't think it was right to pretend that I did. And so while I honored her request to keep going to church until I was 18, I stopped taking communion, I stopped saying the creeds, and I started listening to the sermons with an even more critical ear, searching for logical inconsistencies, silently daring the minister to prove me wrong in my disbelief. He was a kind man, someone I liked and respected, but given the bar I required him to jump, he would inevitably fall short. At the same time that I was distancing myself from the religion of my childhood, my best friend was becoming more devoted to his. He was attending a large evangelical congregation in town, a church with lots of programs and opportunities for music making and ministry. He told me it was awesome and that he wanted me to attend. We had discussed religion, and I had told him of my doubts. I had told him that I was having trouble with the notion of an all-powerful God who distributes iniquities and who loves us even as he threatens us with eternal punishment. My friend was undeterred by my questions and critiques and kept inviting me to join him for a Sunday night youth service until I finally gave in. As we arrived in the chapel where the service was held, the mood was upbeat and friendly. It was fun to be around so many people my age. The music was more current than the hymns we sang in my family's church, and I could see that people were really enjoying it. I told myself to try to keep an open mind and to withhold judgment. I was doing okay until the youth pastor began a sermon that could have been titled, "Don't Be Friends with Non-Believers." He spoke of how wrong and dangerous people like me were and instructed his flock to cut ties with anyone who isn't Christian. I could feel my friend slumping in his chair beside me. Even as the sermon angered and disappointed me, it did help me understand why my friend and I seemed to be drifting apart. We talked about it on the way home, and he told me he was sorry about what had happened. But I was now elevated enough on my high horse and eager to say, "I told you so," that I probably wasn't very compassionate in response or accepting of his apology. The experience in the chapel that night offered me a delicious brew of righteous indignation. that I continued to drink into my adulthood, and that enabled me to put my friend beneath me in ways that weren't helpful for our friendship or for my understanding of his point of view. I took this negative experience I'd had in his church and I applied it to Christianity, as though the youth pastor's perspective was the quintessential expression of the faith I was now dismissing. Never mind my mother's lived experience of her faith, which was open and loving. Never mind my own lived experience of the Christian churches of my childhood, in which adults had showed a loving interest in me, had encouraged me, had wanted the best for me. I now had evidence that some Christians were dismissive of non-believers, so I had even more reason to be dismissive of them. Around this time, my high school English class had a unit on the Bible as literature. Seems kind of wacky to me now, as this was a public high school, but at the time, no one seemed to question it. Maybe because in the previous units that year, we had discussed Greek mythology and Roman mythology. During one class, when we had been reading the story from Genesis, in which God tells Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, I was troubled that none of my classmates questioned the ethics of this narrative. I asked the teacher, who had told us she was a Christian, how people could have a faith in a God who would do this. I asked this question in the midst of the class. I knew I was being confrontational, that my questioning her faith was beyond the scope of the class, but I truly wanted to know. She was patient in her response, explaining how faith, for her, is something that is not about one story, how it is something that develops over time through lived experience. I kept pushing. I don't get it, I said. Back and forth we went for a while in front of the class, until I asked her what she would do if God asked her to sacrifice her son. She paused and gave me a weary look that indicated it was time to move on. So I stopped my interrogation. A year or so later, I was telling my older brother about the exchange I'd had in that English class, and he shook his head. Mark, don't you know her son died when he was a teenager? It had been a freak accident, I learned, in which he had choked to death. Now I was the one slumping in my chair. I did have a right to question the content of that English class, and I also had the right to be confrontational about it. But I became aware that my choice to be confrontational about someone else's faith had consequences. Consequences that could negatively impact my relationships. Consequences worth considering. Going to college took me even further away from the faith of my childhood. My growing friendships with gays and lesbians, some of whom shared stories of persecution that had come from the church, and my exposure to literature and philosophy critical of faith, and my lack of meaningful connections with people who identified as faithful, all led me to be even more rigid in my blanket assessments of Christians and religion in general. Over the next few years, when I would find myself in church, say when I would go with my girlfriend's family, I would try to appreciate the experience, but I would inevitably focus on the negative, seeking to confirm my own biases. And nothing changed much for me, internally or externally. Religion was what other people did. My integrity was tied to my rejection of it. Imagine my surprise when, living in New York City in my late 20s, I started singing in an Episcopal church as a favor to a friend of mine, and I started seeing a different side of religion, the side that had always been there, but that I had conveniently overlooked. I experienced a Christian church where gays and lesbians were honored, where justice work on behalf of progressive values was pursued, where differences in theological perspective were not dismissed. I experienced a Christian church focused on love and compassion, in which the only disconnects for me came in the finer details of the dogma, not in the spirit that was being sought, nor the spirit that was being created. I could feel myself shifting towards being more open to the possibility of my own religious life, I had heard about Unitarian Universalism, but had never been to a UU church. Now I was ready. My first Sunday, I confess I was still looking for ways to be offended. So much so that if we had sung that hymn that we started with today, Bring Many Names, I might have questioned whether I should return. While I could appreciate all the different ways the hymn invites us to think about God, I would have needed a different verse to capture my reality. I would have needed a verse that would go something like this. No God at all, not that I can know. Please don't ask me to believe what I can't. I'm quick to be put off, so won't you leave me space? Hail and Hosanna, no God at all. We didn't sing Bring Many Names my first morning, and any mention of God was done without the assumption that we all believed. Over the next few months, as I participated in the newcomers classes and some adult religious education opportunities at the church, as well as volunteering to teach the 5th grade Sunday school students, I could see even more clearly that belief in God was not actually a requirement of being a UU. It was a relief and an inspiration to me. It wasn't too long before I began to feel an even deeper pull to this religion that left space for God, but that didn't require it. Within a year, I enrolled in theological school with the expectation that I might become a UU minister. Borderline atheist, definite agnostic that I was, how could I know for sure that ministry would be a fit? But I looked forward to the adventure of it, and I knew pursuing this path would take me somewhere that I needed to go. I still had a lot of baggage to put down. I remember in my first year we were reading an essay by the 20th century Unitarian theologian James Luther Adams. I now know that Adams was a giant in the expression of liberal religion. He was a scholar, a thinker, an activist who I would come to greatly appreciate. But in my first reaction paper to his writing, I'm embarrassed to admit, I focused more on my critique of his use of Christian language and symbols than on the thrust and possible truth of what he had been saying. Around this time, I did discover writings of theologians who were speaking in language and symbols that worked for me. Process theologians, Paul Tillich, the early religious humanists like John Dietrich, and a former minister of this church, Curtis Reese, who had been preaching my emerging gospel decades earlier, a gospel that was moving away from disproving God and toward the nurturing of a religion that would, as Reese said, not be shaken if the very idea of God were to pass away. But I was still more anxious to be offended than I was to be inspired. I was still trapped by the literal and closed off to the symbolic. I was still more eager to dismiss traditional religious language than to translate its terms into understandings that could work for me. Well, things started to change for me, not unlike Carissa, when I served as a chaplain for a Chicago hospital that summer. I began there wondering how I would be able to serve those with more God-centered theologies. How would I have integrity praying to a God I wasn't sure I believed in? It didn't take long for me to understand that my personal theological point of view would always be less important in pastoral care than the theology of the person I was visiting. I was there to bring comfort by serving their understanding of the holy. My integrity as a minister in those challenging moments where words didn't come easily was about being flexible and responsive rather than limited by my own predispositions or certainty about matters of faith. It helped that the theological perspective to which I had been most drawn at the time was that of a 20th century liberal theologian named Henry Nelson Wyman, who had said that God was the product of what he called creative interchange, which he described as the intentional communication of people who are led by their curiosity and their desire to understand the perspectives of another person so that they could integrate those understandings into their own. For Wyman, the holy was what happened when people engaged with the expectation that they could actually be changed by the encounter. Wyman's God emerged from relationship. chaplain work for me was a powerful laboratory of creative interchange. The more I gave myself to it, the more I gave myself to open listening, to honestly seeking to understand, to expecting to grow my perspectives by respectfully engaging with the perspectives of others, the more effective I was as a chaplain, and the more I grew as a person of faith. One of my favorite stories from this time was when I had spent about 30 minutes with an elderly patient, listening to him work through his anger and his confusion at his circumstances. At the conclusion of my visit, after we had shared a prayer that I had crafted in response to the content of our conversation, he held my hand with tears in his eyes, and he said, "Mark, I'm so glad they sent you and not one of those damned liberals." Now, you may think in that exchange I had compromised my integrity. And I'll admit I would have once thought that too. But I believe I had complete integrity in that exchange, at least the integrity that matters to me. I didn't have to agree with my companion's understanding of the holy to open myself to it enough so that we could both be served. My vision of the holy, my integrity as a person of faith, was now focused on leaving space, on seeking to understand rather than to convince, on engagement rather than avoidance. This is the religion that I believe we most need in our world today. A religion less about certainty and more about curiosity. A religion that trades pronouncements for possibilities. A religion that asks us to truly respect the inherent worth and dignity of others by focusing less on what people believe and more on how they act. This is the religion I find in our most faithful Unitarian Universalist practices, regardless of our differences in belief. This is the religion embodied in our way of being together on Sunday mornings, in that none of you is expected to agree with me or to agree with the wording of the hymns or the meditations in order to belong. Our services are meant to spark your own thinking. They should never be seen as the final word, but rather the beginning of a respectful conversation intended to help us all grow. This is the religion expressed in our Soul Matters program, which is currently inviting new people to register. The Soul Matters program, where participants gather once a month in groups of 6 to 10 to share responses to suggested spiritual exercises and questions about the meaning of life without expectations of agreement. In Soul Matters, we grow through open listening and respectful sharing, not through debate. This is the religion that's rooted in our commitment to pursue meaningful connections with one another, seeking not to convince nor coerce toward any particular theological point of view, but rather to open ourselves up more fully to understanding our differences and finding our commonalities as members of one human family. In these days following the terrorist attack on the office of Charlie Hebdo, religion, once again, is being denounced by those who seek to paint all faith with the same broad brush. As comedian Bill Maher said on Wednesday in words that are cheered by many, all religions are stupid and dangerous. I support Bill's right to say that, and I'm grateful that we live in a culture where he can say that, even as my lived experience leads me to disagree. In my life, I've been inspired by atheists, by agnostics, and by people of faith. My interfaith work in the community, for example, has helped me better understand the call of different religious traditions toward justice and compassion, and to respect the ways the faithful of those religions live those expectations into actions that make a positive difference. I also support the right of the cartoonists of Charlie Hebdo to create tasteless, mostly unfunny caricatures of religion, and I would denounce attempts by anyone who would seek to take away their right to be offensive. And yet my understanding of the holy and the kind of engagement that truly honors inherent worth and dignity and the interdependent web of life leads me to yearn for communication based in reflective engagement rather than reckless ridicule and offensive button pushing for sport. Violent or repressive actions committed in the name of religion should always be condemned. But sweeping statements dismissing religion as stupid are not helpful, and attempts to eliminate non-coercive religious expressions, whether from our common life or even from our own congregation, are not only doomed to fail, they are dangerous in their self-righteous certainty and are at odds with Unitarian Universalism, at least the kind of Unitarian Universalism I want to affirm and promote. In the days to come, may those of us most inclined to declare the righteousness of our own viewpoints find ourselves liberated from our need to be right about speculative matters. May we leave room for differences of belief, even as we condemn actions that are harmful to the common good. May we seek more to understand than to be understood. And may we give ourselves more fully to the continued creation of a religion of true integrity, a religion that does not require God, but that welcomes many names for the holy. A religion that seeks common ground amidst our differences, that encourages us towards knowing each other's hearts as much as we know each other's minds. A religion that helps each of us to truly be open to life, expecting to love, and prepared to serve. May it be so. Amen.